Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for joining us on this evening. I don't know quite what it's like where you are, but where I am in rural Aberdeenshire, it's rather a wet night, so not as nice as last week. Thank you all very much for joining us. Welcome back to those of you who joined us last week, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the second of these two webinars. And these are jointly organised by the Stapleton Trust, of which I'm the chair of the committee, the British Society of Animal Science, and also the British Grasslands Society. The first one that took place last week was a webinar about the science of soil. Where we're moving on to today is looking at policy. Because when we're thinking about locking carbon in soil, which I'm sure, well, I hope everyone online thinks and agrees is very important, then it is not going to actually happen unless the policy environment is right, and also that farmers and land managers generally feel comfortable, have an incentive to actually do it. So what we wanted to do as the three societies was to bring together a mixed grouping of people and facilitate a discussion so that we all had a better idea of what was the most efficient way to move forward on this. It's a complex area, there's no simple solutions, but hopefully together by the end of this hour, and we will go on probably slightly past 7 o'clock, just if there's lots of questions and to answer. Could I just ask everyone who's not speaking to actually mute themselves and also turn off their videos? The process that we'll be going through is that we will actually be taking questions on chat. You can find the chat button in the middle at the bottom. If you click on that, and it will come up with a column on the right. Feel free to put your questions into the chat. You can do it even as the person is speaking. We will, I think, try and wait to have all the questions at the end, but if you have an if I see a burning question in there, I might ask the speaker to answer that immediately after their particular talk. So let me move on to just very briefly summarise from last week some of the key issues and how they relate to policy. So one point that came up was the amount of time it takes for carbon levels in soil to change in a measurable way. And what that means for policy is it's not very easy then to have a policy instrument that is dependent on actually making those measurements. The second point I just wanted to bring out from last week was the diversity in carbon levels in soils. Can we really predict how much potential there still is for carbon sequestration in a particular site? And there was some debate about that last week, and science is about debate, so if that comes up again, fine. And then finally, last time there was a bit of interest in the chat on mixed crop livestock systems. Are there any policy options under consideration? Should there be? Again, questions for chat. I'm not expecting the speakers to answer these questions, but they are points to bear in mind while you consider the complexities which policymakers face. So we have three speakers tonight, and one thing I wanted to say at the start was policy is an easy word to say. It sounds simple, but actually policy covers a huge range of things, from the policies at the global level down to the policy for health and safety, for example, in your workplace. And the information needed at those different levels is very different. So when they're thinking about what science needs to deliver, we need to think about which questions are we answering. All of those policy levels are actually needed, but let's come back to that in the discussion. So I want to move forward and introduce our first speaker. And our speaker is Rebecca Heaton, who is speaking to us tonight as a member of the UK Climate Change Committee. And that's a committee that feeds into government. I'm sure Becky will say more about that. She has a 20-year global career working at interface between business, science and policy. So she understands this complex interface. She has a background in forestry. She's a chartered forester, but her expertise spans energy, climate change and land use, and particularly that interface between business and the part that it has to play in enabling the UK to decarbonise. So over to you, Becky.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to explain a little bit about the Committee on Climate Change and what we are, and then talk about some of the things which we have suggested around changes to land use to try and help the UK to meet its decarbonisation targets. So if I start, I say I'm quite new to this presenting, here we are. So the UK has a Climate Change Act, which was established in 2008. We were the first country in the world to have a Climate Change Act, so we're quite proud of this. What it's composed of 8 climate change commissioners, of which I'm one of them, and my other colleagues are all very well-known scientists, and I sort of represent business interests on the committee. And then we've got a secretariat of about 30 who do the analysis. And what I would say is we have some experts, but none of us are experts on all of this. And we're certainly not experts in the level which you are as an audience tonight. So I'm really keen to learn from you, and also to say, please help us to get the next tranche of policy right as well. So a little bit about where we are and why what the Climate Change Act does is it sets a target, and then it sets carbon budgets to help meet that target, which the government debate and accept or otherwise. So far they've accepted those carbon budgets. We also have a requirement, we require the government to bring forward policies, and we make suggestions on what some of those policies might be at a really high level. So we're not going to be going into, you must do this particular thing in this area, but we look at the pathways which we think could be used to meet the targets, and we suggest policies which could help move in that direction. We also monitor the government's progress, so we produce annual progress reports. We've just produced one actually, and it was pretty shocking. I think the government only met 2 out of over 30 of the policies which we suggested they might bring forward. So it's not going terribly well at the moment, but I do believe we have a really good framework for it going into the future. I'm just going to show you a quick slide here about carbon budgets. So this is what drives all of our analysis. So this chart is from this chart shows the legislated carbon budgets, which so far we've had 5 legislated carbon budgets, which set the budget, the amount of carbon the UK can produce up to 2033. You should note this was set under a target of an 80% reduction of carbon emissions by 2050 compared to 1990. Last year, we advised the government that actually to be compliant with Paris and the agreement which the government had signed up to in the Paris Agreement, we actually needed to have a net zero target for government by 2050. So that dotted line on the chart, we can expect to reduce right down to zero. And we're also suggesting that the green bit there is and the red bit, sorry, is aviation and shipping. So the green bit will go because we're now saying it's got to be zero, and the red bit by 2050 will also go because that's aviation and shipping, which we're saying we should now include in our overall target. So a big thing we're working on at the moment is what's called the 6th carbon budget, and we are statutorily obliged to release this before the end of the year, and that sets the budget for carbon emissions from 2033 to 2037. And I think this is pretty important in terms of a carbon budget which will lead us to that 2050 zero. Basically, if we don't set out the framework of how we think the UK should look in that time period, we're probably not going to get to 2050. If we haven't got those policies in place and those kind of quite large changes to our society in place by then, it's probably not going to happen. So we see this as being a really significant carbon budget to set. And so in that context, we have set out a call for evidence, which I think is now closed. It's not too late though to feed in. We've set up various expert and advisory groups to help us with that. And I really would ask very much that you get involved, because we really need some support around some of the grassland issues. So moving on to the next slide, just to very quickly show you where we have got to in the UK. On the left, you can look at from 1990 to 2015, the emissions from different sectors. And you can see it's the power sector, that big red bar, which has really dropped quite significantly, and the others have done much, much less. So we've sort of done the easy bit, and that's why we've so far met all of our carbon budgets. I think it's going to get a lot harder from now on, and we're beginning to look in more detail in a lot of the other sectors. And one of the sectors we hadn't really looked at in a lot of detail was land use. So we produced a land use report in January. And for the first time, we really looked at some of the policies that might be needed to bring forth the change which we see. So for this, we had various advisory groups and expert groups. I don't know if anyone on the call fed in. I really hope you did. But if I go through some of the things which we suggested now coming up. So the first slide here shows, I think we really want to sort of focus on that final bar at the end, and it shows how we see land use emissions in 2050 if we are to meet net zero. Now, we're not saying this is how it has to be. We're just, as a committee on climate change, we have to be science-based, and we have to show that there are ways to get there. We can't be speculative. So, you know, you have Extinction Rebellion, for example, saying let's do it by 2030, we'll work out how to do it. We actually have to set numbers in concrete and say we know we can get there. So we can't really have too many speculative things in. So this is one set of options which can give us the result which we need. And as you see, there is a reduction in the green bar, which is of agricultural emissions. Settlements we think will go up predominantly in England. We're saying that some peatland must be restored, and so that gives us a drop in peatland emissions. And then all of this is offset by more afforestation, some trees on farms and agroforestry and energy crops, and also some other, which is reductions in grassland and cropland. So I hope that chart makes sense. I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about what we're saying around some of those now. So to enable those increases in forestry, and also to enable some land to be taken out on peatland to be restored, we do need to look at productivity. You must be much more familiar with this graph than I am. So this slide deck has probably been written for a less initiated audience than yourself, or less knowledgeable rather. So if you look here, as I'm sure you're all aware, agricultural productivity is lower in the UK. What can we do to increase that with all respect to biodiversity and with carbon emissions that could then free up some land to plant some trees on farms, and to also restore peatland? So I'm now going to put up what I believe could be quite a controversial chart. So I'm usually talking to large groups of farmers or to land-based commercial people, and what I'm saying is we have to make really sure that we don't offshore our emissions. So we in the UK should be proud of the meat that we produce, and that we can produce it in a way which is good for the environment and for greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is a really macro level. You're always going to have examples where this might not hold true, but our message is to government, and what we wanted to say to government was, you need to make sure we don't just start importing meat which will give us which is produced with a worse greenhouse gas footprint than the UK can produce its own meat. So this is quite a powerful graph that set up one of our principles, which was, we said we need to regulate meat imports. So that was one of our regulations which we suggested. We also said, so we've suggested regulation really on some of the no regrets things. We've suggested financial support to help farmers to change, and we've also suggested some enabling measures around training and around education. I haven't got long, so I'm going to quickly go past that one and say, what did we say about forestry and agroforestry? So I'm a forester, so we're not generally fans of agroforestry. I would prefer to say it's trees on farms. I would prefer to say it's hedgerows and it's shelter belts. I think the definition of agroforestry has been expanded very much in the recent years, from being what I was taught as a student, which was, you know, trees with combine harvesters running between them, to actually just talking a little bit more about having more trees in an agricultural landscape. We don't think the government are going to have an awful lot of money for this, so we're thinking this might have to come through trading and through sectors which are emitting, particularly aviation, buying offsets from forestry, but making that really, really credible. So that's something that we think the government should really work on, and the UK might have a role globally in setting those sort of accounting measurements. We've also said about bringing broadly forestry back into management. We think there's a real role there for storing carbon, doing that. Next slide. What does low carbon farming mean? So I think, again, I'm very aware I'm talking to people who are much more expert than me on this. There's been quite a lot of voluntary measures which we don't think have been delivering, so we think they should be regulated. So this is reducing on-farm emissions, such as the nitrate vulnerable zones. We also think we should be using some of the new legislation, such as that proposed in the Clean Air Strategy. And also we've been talking a lot with feed producers about incorporating methane inhibiting additives as well. We also think public money is going to be needed for some of the more expensive measures here. And peatland restoration. So we got lambasted for this, that we didn't talk about restoring all peatland. We've only talked about really restoring upland peatland. That's because a lot of lowland peatland is really prime agricultural soils. And what we did with our analysis was we assumed that the UK would still produce the same amount of food as it does today in 2050. So we couldn't take out all of that land. What we have said really clearly is further development of the peatland code is needed. And also, we shouldn't be selling peat for horticultural uses. So we want a ban on that, and we want a ban on imports. Right, I've got to move on. I'm not going to talk too much about energy crops. I'm not going to talk too much about that. We've also looked a bit at dietary change. This has become really controversial. What we've done is we've looked at what the NHS have said. We've said the NHS is saying there should be a 20% reduction in meat eating for health reasons. We've also looked at where the trends are going, and we've based it on that. Again, we've been lambasted for not actually going further. But we feel that that's an appropriate number to look at. What we're really keen on doing is making a recommendation around food waste. So there's a terrific amount, I think it's 13 million tonnes of food are wasted every year, of which 3.5 million tonnes is on farms. So let's sort that out before we stop doing too much in terms of really changing our land use. We should just be using the land we've got better, which is reducing that on-farm waste. Right, I can see you there. Oh gosh, what have I done? Something. I think that means I'm at the end, actually. So that was a little bit of a romp, Maggie. But I think my time's up.
Yep.
I'll stop sharing.
Thanks very much indeed, Becky. And I think that's given us a great start, showing us the complexities, starting at showing that actually land use and agriculture have to fit in with all the other things that the government's trying to achieve to meet that top level target. So there are a lot of questions for you, Becky, in the chat. So if you'd like to start replying to those, as well as actually listening to the next speaker. But there was just one that I wanted to ask, which was, do these figures on carbon include carbon embedded in imported products?
I think they do, yes, yeah. And I was just thinking I need to check that. Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, okay. I can answer the other ones, some of the other ones now. Yeah. Yeah,
so the rest of you just feel free to answer them. And if you want to pick any up in the overall discussion and put in more of those, that'd be fine then. Great. Okay, thanks very much. So we're moving on now to our second speaker, Jürgen Olesen. Jürgen is Professor in Agriculture and Climate Change at Aarhus University, Department of Agroecology, and he's been head of that department since this year. He has had a lot of experience in working at this agriculture policy interface, and that was all in the bio that was on the link. He's been a leading author in IPCC reports. He's worked for the World Bank, FAO, EU, and he's so I'll leave Jürgen to, as he goes through his talk, describe some of those experiences. His talk's titled How to Manage Critical Scientific Thinking in a Policy Environment That Needs Carbon Sequestration. Over to you, Jürgen.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, indeed.
And was very interesting to also hear about the policy in the UK. We've just advanced our policy in Denmark. We also have a climate neutrality policy by 2050 and a 70% reduction by 2030. And in fact, if we look at our baseline emissions in Denmark by 2030, agriculture is going to account for almost 40% of those. So we have a huge challenge also here, also recognized by policy and the government and so on. So we're stepping up also greatly on research to deal with this. Now, what I wanted to talk about is also what I see as some of the potential conflicts that I also experience between not just policy and research and scientists, but also with stakeholders. And it's related to the fact that if we are going to achieve this ambitions of climate neutrality and staying beyond a 2-degree global warming, we're going to have to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere, because there's no way that we can reduce the other greenhouse gases and the consumption of fossil fuels so quickly that it is going to be sufficient. And of course, there's various ways of stocking that carbon. Some of it, of course, is carbon capture storage, where you store it in geological formations, taking CO2 out of smokestacks, for instance, and then putting it down. And the other potential possibility is storage in vegetation, forests, wetlands, things like that, but also, of course, in our soils. And that, of course, that concern by policy stakeholders enhances ambitions to actually do something, and also to get credited for this. And it also puts actually an increasing ambition and also concern by also citizens and consumers, which also drives the concern by food retail and producers, dairy business, and so on, to deal with this. And they're also looking at the possibility of counting for carbon storage there, because that, well, I experience it as a potential quick fix for this. But there are a lot of concerns here, at least when you're a concerned scientist. And some of those issues that I have are related to are what we're doing really additional to what we're doing anyway? What is the permanency of what we are doing? Does the carbon actually stay there? Can we document this? And in fact, how do we include it in terms of reporting, monitoring, verification issues? That is a concern if we want to have this implemented. Some of you may also know about the 4 per mil concept that was launched with the Paris Agreement. The idea about the 4 per mil is that if we could enhance global carbon stocks by 4 per mil, 4 per thousand, in soils, that's all soils, not just the agricultural ones, but all of them, then that would actually balance the fossil fuel CO2 emissions. So this would solve everything, so to speak, if we could just do this. But there are challenges with this. First of all, do we actually have sufficient measures to deal with this? It actually, if we're going to store more carbon in soils, we are going to put more in there. There's no way we can enhance soil carbon without having enhanced inputs. And that means putting more biomass back actually to soil. But that actually competes with increasing demands for biomass for consumption, not just for food, but for energy, for biomaterials, and all the other things where we need to substitute the fossil carbon. The other concern is the permanency of soil carbon, because we're already losing quite a lot of the existing carbon pools, in particular in the peatlands. That also goes for Denmark. I think what we'll have to do is, we're not just concerned with some of our peatlands, we want to take them all out of agricultural land use. Measures for enhancing carbon stocks, if we want to increase them, they have to be maintained, because otherwise we lose the carbon again. And we're up against the wall also when it comes to global warming, because we're not going to stop global warming just with this. That's going to be continuing, and global warming in itself will enhance the decomposition of soil carbon, so that will actually make it more difficult to actually sequester some of this carbon. There's some estimates of this, and these numbers are really big. So overall, my assessment here is, first of all, enhancing soil carbon depends on the balance between increasing inputs and the decomposition. The decomposition is going to increase because of increasing temperatures. So it's going to be challenging just to maintain current carbon levels in the soil. But if we were to look at this 4 per mil, what to actually do, and if we look at a global average of soil organic carbon in agricultural land, it's about 160 tons carbon per hectare. And if we were to increase it by these 4 per mil, that would mean we need to enhance that rate by 0.6 tons of carbon per hectare. And if we were to look at what that would mean in terms of increased input, assuming a 50% of the biomass input were actually to be stored, or at least on a medium term level, that would mean 4 tons of carbon per hectare, or 9 tons of carbon, 9 tons of biomass per hectare, which is equivalent to what we get in high yielding winter wheat crops. So we just have to let the grain stay in the field, which of course we're not going to do. So we could do something else, and I've listed some options here. And actually, the only option that actually would suffice here would be turning arable land into grassland, which actually would work, and that would increase carbon storage for at least maybe a century or so until it levels off. But would that meet our requirements for food security and so on? So we need to work on enhanced net primary productivity that would allow us to have some carbon left in the field, so that we can. And another thing we do, of course, is enhance the return of resilient carbon. So make some of that carbon more resilient, like with pyrolysis and biochar. And of course, we need to keep the crop residues in the field or turn them into something more resilient. I'm not going to go through this graph. That actually illustrates some of the other greenhouse gases that we need to worry with, methane, nitrous oxide in particular, but it also illustrates the fact that soil carbon and soil nitrogen is linked. Soil organic matter is not just carbon, it's also nitrogen, and it comes with also other nitrogen turnover processes. All of this is driven really basically in the soil by microbial processes, and there's a balance that when we enhance soil carbon, we also enhance soil organic nitrogen. That in addition might drive some of the processes that also affect nitrous oxide emissions. It's illustrated here. This was a PhD study of a few years back by Bénédicte Autré from INRA, and she clearly showed, and that's shown on the middle graph in here, is as you enhance soil carbon input, then the soil organic carbon stock also changes, it increases. But we're at different levels in different field experiments here. And it all depends on where you're coming from, really. But if you're to plot, and you can see that on the graph to the right, if you plot that change in the soil organic carbon stock with the nitrogen surplus, it plots neatly on a line. And that's, of course, because soil organic matter has a very narrow range of the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So as we want to enhance the soil organic carbon, we also need to have a higher nitrogen surplus. We simply need nitrogen also for this. But as we enhance the nitrogen, we also risk having more nitrous oxide emissions. So some of what we're doing with enhancing carbon will be balanced potentially by higher nitrous oxide emissions. But some of course, what we can do is also related to reductions in the nitrogen losses. So if we can do that part of it, like having maybe more cut-based systems versus grazing-based systems, having in arable farming more cover crops and so on, that provides part of the solution, but generally is not sufficient. Another issue is how do we actually deal with knowing where we are? And that's extremely complicated, actually, and quite a lot of what we're dealing with, because it's of no use, of course, that we try to do something that doesn't work. But it's extremely difficult to measure changes in soil organic carbon by just measuring things. And that's because we are measuring really very small changes in a large pool. And there is a large spatial variation. There's actually also temporal variations, because there's temporal variation in some of the less degraded carbon, and it's difficult to separate with measurements the different states of degradability. So we generally need to resort to models. Models that are, of course, supported by data that provide the inputs for such models, for initializing them, and for providing the inputs on these carbon. And that could be input on the type of management. It could also be input on yields. It could be inputs maybe from remote sensing on vegetation cover and so on. So all of these models, they are generally used both for life cycle assessments, they're used for national monitoring and so on. And they of course also comes with quite a large of degree of uncertainty, again, depending on their complexity and also on the data that supports them. In the national setup that also goes with the United Nations framework on climate change, where you have to report to, there's also a requirement for verification. So there needs to be other types of activity data and maybe also sampling from an existing network to support that these models and model results are performing correctly. I'll move to the last slide here, and we're currently having an ongoing, well, we're completing exactly the European project, the CICASA project. It's developing a global research agenda on these soil carbon amounts, and this, of course, in the end, is meant to support implementation of soil carbon initiatives. But there's quite a lot of things we don't know so much about, and if you look at this here in theme 1, this is more the fundamental scientific issues, which has to do with stabilization of soil organic carbon in the soil, can soils be saturated? What are the roles of different types of microorganisms? What's the balance with other types of greenhouse gas emissions in our mineral soils, particularly nitrous oxide? But if you go to the peatlands, it's methane. And can we, in deep soil, can we actually store more in the subsoils of our soils? Theme 2 is how do we actually account for things, and that's equally important if we're going to deal with it. So it's about measuring, monitoring this. It's about vegetation management, the issue of organic amendments, agricultural land management practices, and equally important, and that goes for some farmers that might have high initial soil carbon stocks. It's equally important preserving soil carbon than increasing them. And theme 3 here has to do with how to incentivize things. We can have economic barriers, social, cultural barriers. There can be institutional, legal barriers, and of course, what is the technological readiness for dealing with these. So this is highly complex, and I'm afraid there is no quick fix to this because there are challenges at all scales, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jürgen. And there are quite a number of questions in the chat for you. If you'd like to start responding to those,
I will do so.
Yeah, then we will move on, and then at the end, if there's some that you want to give more detail on than you can in the chat, then we can do that in the open session. Excellent, great. So I see that Paul has turned on his video, which is great. So let me just introduce him. Paul Muto works as Senior Specialist in Grassland Agronomy for Natural England. And we wanted to have in this talk, we wanted to remind people that it's not all just about carbon. We cannot do carbon, locking carbon in at the expense of everything else. So we wanted to also make sure that we're covering another very important challenge of our time, which is in relation to biodiversity. And Paul is a strong advocate of agroecological approaches. He's been involved in organic agriculture, grazing systems management, and agroforestry. So over to you, Paul.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. Oh gosh. There we go.
I was just going to say there's a lot in the chat about reducing meat consumption. Let's not have another meeting about that. Let's concentrate on soil carbon, although we might be a few minutes at the end if people really want to go on that. Great. Paul, so
okay, so thank you very much, Maggie. Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you. We can see your notes on the next slide. I don't know, but that's fine. Doesn't really matter.
Do you not have the presentation that doesn't show the notes?
No, but we had that trouble before, so that's fine. Just
I should be able to fix that. No.
Don't worry.
Okay. Okay, so, but yeah, my name is Paul Muto. I have a few moments here to discuss how Natural England policy works with locking carbon into grasslands. And as Maggie said, it's Natural England didn't set out to design policy specifically for locking into carbon, but we do aim in developing our policy to not only cover biodiversity, but we try to achieve things that will also benefit soil carbon as well. And that's becoming a more closer focus for us as schemes move on and develop. So I wanted to focus primarily on our agri-environment options. And we've always focused quite a bit on grassland, different types of grassland management for biodiversity primarily, but all of our grassland options do also have benefits for soil carbon as well. And I put these into three separate categories. And the first one is grassland creation. So essentially creating new grassland, usually from arable land. And as Jürgen mentioned, this is the one that really gives you the largest carbon gain. Generally in arable systems, you're starting off from a very low baseline of carbon, and our grassland creation options, which are primarily targeted at achieving biodiversity aims. So we have the creation of species-rich grassland, grassland to prevent erosion, usually done under our catchment-sensitive farming targets, grassland for species, so wet grassland for breeding waders. We also have grass creation to protect archaeology, so the historic environment. So all of these grassland creation options that we have had under environmental stewardship and now countryside stewardship are fairly easy gains for soil carbon. So that's what I call our low-hanging fruit approach to soil carbon. The other option or series of options that we have are ways to incorporate grass back into arable rotations, so our temporary lays. And this is primarily focused on what's called our herbal lay option. And this is looking at trying to reintegrate grass and particularly grazing livestock back into arable systems. It's a practice that should have never really gone away, but over the past few decades, we've shifted away from the importance of rotating grass within our arable rotations towards a more straightforward arable production. So with the development of this option, we do have gains for soil carbon over the long run, which is perhaps not as permanent, but at least within the rotation, it does tend to increase soil carbon overall. The last one is our grassland management option. So these are options that are targeted already at permanent grassland, and they're ones that are a lot more challenging to quantify the effect on soil carbon. We know they have benefits for species. We know that there are some immediate gains for reducing carbon footprints. So things like reducing inputs, nitrogen, fertilizer, etc., can have quite an impact on the overall carbon footprint. But again, they're very difficult to measure and monitor. The one thing that all of our grassland options have in common is the focus on diversity. And this is something that's not totally focused on broader diversity or specific habitats, but there's a lot of evidence that diversity can improve productivity in mixed grasslands. It's something called the complementarity effect. In other words, if you have plants with a variety of different functions and structures, it does help to be more efficient with regards to improving soil carbon storage in the soil. Diverse mixtures, particularly those that include legumes, require less nitrogen fertilizer. So we do get a reduction of carbon from the manufacturing or from the lack of manufacturing of fertilizer. And there's also the reduction of N2O emissions as well. So just by promoting diversity in grasslands, we do seem to achieve benefits for carbon as well. Now, the big challenge with diverse grasslands is that it's not as straightforward to manage. It's a lot easier to manage a single species of grass. So there are challenges in achieving diverse grasslands. Certainly in our temporary lays, they do consist of improved grasses but they also include legumes and other herbs. And one of the challenge is a lot of farmers aren't familiar with managing anything other than perennial ryegrass. So this has proven to be something that requires adjustment over time. For new grasslands, we do aim to produce species-rich grassland, but one challenge is finding enough appropriate seed. And this is something as our aims and ambitions for creating new grassland increase, ensuring that we have enough diversity for the future with regards to our seed resource is something that's going to become an important focus. Even for our low input grasslands, low input permanent grasslands, a lot of our improved grasses are designed with fairly high inputs in mind. So again, do we have the grasses and improved herbs at hand that are better adapted to these low input systems? So I'll just wrap it up with this one slide. We have two reports, or one report coming up that is of interest with regards to soil carbon, and it's our review of carbon storage and sequestration by habitat, and that's due out later this year. It's an update of a previous 2012 report, but it has a lot more recent data and evidence in it. So just to summarize, carbon dynamics is an integral part of what Natural England does with regards to our policy and practice. And we're I actually do have one more slide. There is a carbon farming test and trial coming up in the ELMS program, but that's relatively new and I'm trying to find out more about it. So just watch this space for additional information on that.
Great, thanks very much, Paul. And that actually brings up, especially that last one, grass and livestock in terrible rotation, some of what's been going on in the chat, which has been about grass versus arable. Excuse me. Okay, so thanks to Paul, and questions in the chat, and keep answering those, and I will pick out some themes at the end to have a more open discussion. And I'm very pleased to see that Drew McConnell is joined us. And Drew, congratulations on becoming president of British Grassland Society, which I understood happened last night. And Drew, together with his wife Val, runs a mainly dairy farm with beef and sheep enterprises as well. It's an all grass farm in West Tyrone in Northern Ireland. And we particularly wanted to have a farmer, and since BGS was one of the organisers of this, particularly appropriate to have this brand new president speaking to us tonight. And Drew's going to give us a view from the front line of farming and what does it all mean and what are the sorts of things that make sense from a farming point of view. So over to you, Drew.
Thanks very much, Maggie. I'm delighted to join you tonight, and a few hiccups with the internet, but that's part of living out in West Tyrone, I'm afraid. First of all, on behalf of the BGS, we're delighted to be involved with the BSAS and the Stapleton Trust in the webinars on carbon. And for those of you who don't know, we're an organisation promoting grassland, which are made up from scientists, industry reps and farmers. But we change our president every year, and this year's the turn of a farmer, so I'm the fortunate or unfortunate one to have that role this time. So I'll be very selfish and focus on my role as a farmer tonight. But having listened to the talks last night and tonight, the one thing that comes across, my business is very much dependent on the policy you guys come up with, you know, so I'm really in your hands as far as carbon goes and how we can promote and make best use of it. As grassland farmers, you know, we have a new tool here. We can benefit our business, we can store carbon, yes, but we must be financially rewarded for that somewhere down the line. And what do we need as a farming business? Well, first of all, we need evidence. We need the scientists to come up with good, hard facts. And I know it's very difficult when we're talking something that's long-term as carbon storage and soils, but to change our whole farming policy, we need to see a future in changing it. So we must have that strong science behind it all. and it must be relevant to our business. You know, we farm in the west here, we have clay soils. Our soil is different from the guys in the east of the province, which are sandy and freer draining. You know, we're all grassland. What capabilities has our soils to store more carbon than the guys in the east, or is the other way about? You know, these are all facts that we need so we can focus our business on. And I mentioned earlier about having strong facts, but only today there's a press article over here where the local agricultural minister has requested changes in how we do our greenhouse gas calculations, because he wants to more accurately reflect the sequestration properties of our grassland. And, you know, that has changed. Earlier it was thought that Northern Ireland could probably sequester about 750,000 tonnes every year of carbon. Now it's looking more like the scientists have come up with a figure of 1.2 million. So, you know, where are we there? We need, I suppose, again, back to strong facts on that. And again, their whole system, you know, we've been breeding cattle to be more efficient for years. Are those cattle better at converting forage into beef, into lamb, into milk, and therefore have a lower impact on the environment than the less productive animals that we had in the past? You know, so it's things like that that we need a definite answer to. Another interesting fact that was in the press today, that in the past, Northern Ireland cattle, their global warming effect has been overstated by a factor of 500. You know, that's massive. And again, back to what I said earlier, it's strong, hard facts we need to influence the policy going forward. You know, and if policy means that we're going to have to change our business big style, well, then we need some kind of compensation for that. I think our first speaker tonight mentioned, can farmers be rewarded from big business for storing more carbon in the soils? Potentially, that could be a life changer for some of us. But again, back to what I said earlier, is it's our type of soils. How do we do that? Our hedgerows over here, with quite small family farms, loads of hedgerows. You know, if we harvest those or trim those hedges every 3 years, for example, is there a benefit to leave it every 5 years? Will that sequester more carbon? If we have more hedgerow trees, what effect does that, you know? So as farmers, we probably ask far more questions than we have answers to. But again, that's where we depend on you guys to help us come up with those answers and develop a policy for going forward. So I think, Maggie, that's basically all I have to say, but quite happy to try and answer questions, but I'm a mere farmer, not like all the experts over on your side.
No, it's not a mere farmer. The scientists couldn't actually feed the world without the farmers. So we're all equally important in all of this, in my opinion. Anyway, great. Thanks very much for that. And let's open up now to pick some key questions out of what was there. So, Cled or Michael, did you were scanning the chat for me. Do you have any particular aspects that you want to pick up on, or any question you want to actually?
It's Cled here. I think one of the big issues you referred to in your introduction is that if it's very difficult to measure carbon capture, and as Jorgen said, that even the most complex models have a high degree of uncertainty about it, how do we develop policy initiatives to increase the carbon? What's going to be the reward system if it's so difficult to have a prediction system or a measurement system to measure the result?
Okay, thanks for that. So, Jorgen or Becky? Jorgen, you start off, and then I'll pass over to Becky.
Sure. This is the fundamental issue, and it actually encompasses different issues, right? One thing, of course, overall, what we want to do is we want to increase the overall soil carbon stock. But that can happen in different ways, because in some some fields, some farms may have a low initial soil carbon stock, and of course they have more options to sort of increase, and that's relatively easy to say that what you can apply there is enhancing soil carbon input and so on. And we can monitor that actually just by looking at what crops are we growing, how much do we remove, i.e. what's being returned. So there are some very simple options there that allows us to quickly model this. The other thing, of course, is if you've got an initial high carbon situation, then it's more. Then you're probably not be able to actually increase it. You're just going to have to stabilize and maintain it. So that could be existing grasslands where you just are maintaining the thing. We've been trying to model this also based on existing long-term experiments, for instance, from the potland grass experiment in Rothamsted and so on. And what we get there is our models actually quite well represent this also in the long term. So if we have good data on what are inputs in terms of organic matter with above ground, below ground, and so on, we generally know the situation. The model actually works fairly well. The problem really is having those detailed information on vegetation, on management, and so on. So what I think we need to work on better is that type of management information. Some of it could come from remote sensing. Some of it would need to come from farm management data. But our models are not really that bad. There's still something we need to better understand the role of tillage and things like that.
Okay,
but overall
but you're
they're good.
adding in complexity. So Becky, would you like to come in and comment on how UKCCC deals with some of that complexity?
So we actually haven't gone as far as saying you should reward this in this precise way, because we've had exactly that debate. And I actually said, you know, the only people doing well out of this are going to be the people doing soil cores all over Britain and doing audits. So, you know, how can we do it? I don't think we've got the answers. I would say people have really mixed views. So when we talk to soil scientists, some say, no, this is fine, we can do it. And others say, no, we can't, it's going to cost an awful lot. I said, are there any proxies that we can do? So do we know that we could reward certain behaviours or certain management practices that we can be confident would give a soil gain, a carbon gain over a length of time? So a simple way of, we perhaps know that not tilling should give a carbon gain. So can we just reward that rather than perhaps the actual measurement and quantification of the precise soil carbon increase? I would say some people that have been looking at it is the peatland code. I don't know whether any of you are aware of the IUCN peatland code. That's, you know, if you read it, it's in its infancy. They're having a good go at this. I think there are some real things we could learn from it, but they're saying you measure at baseline and then you measure at year 5 and you measure at year 10 and every 10 years after that. So that accepts its long-term nature, but it has to have some assumption in it to sell those sort of peat offsets in the first place. You know, I'm a forester. I've been working on these sorts of carbon offset issues for 30 years. Trees are a lot easier to measure. We still haven't cracked it. We still haven't cracked remote sensing to measure carbon in trees. It doesn't really work at the moment, so they were really trying, and we think we might get there. It's really hard to be confident that a carbon offset from a forest is additional, is permanent, is all those things. So I do think we've got a challenge there, and let's all get our brains onto it and try and solve it.
Okay, thanks for that. And you start to see there the sort of two different viewpoints from what's actually needed in terms of policy. And I think we need far more debates in relation to this. I want to, I don't think we're going to sort of answer that one, but Paul, would you like to come in on this and say, in Natural England, you're obviously managing land as well. That's my understanding. And in terms of some of those measurements, any contribution to this debate?
Yeah, that's a bit of a challenge. I know we do require soil samples for a lot of our agri-environment options at the beginning of agreements. I believe the aim is to essentially use it as a baseline so that we can monitor over the long term. However, there's a difference between using it strictly for monitoring and whether it is actually supposed to be submitted as evidence that the outcome has been achieved. Um, personally, I'm quite hesitant to. I think there's just too many factors that could make long-term monitoring really that accurate. My preferred approach would be to look at the biodiversity benefit of any of our actions that we take in our agri-environment schemes, assess whether there is some overall evidence that it's beneficial for carbon, but an easier outcome to monitor would be the biodiversity. And I think it's safe to assume that the carbon is going in the direction we want it. But I think that would be an awful burden to be putting on farmers to definitely come up with an absolute proof that yes, what I've done increase soil carbon.
Yes, and then as where payments are concerned, well, particularly in the past from the EU, then there needed to be independent verification of these sorts of things, which also made it quite a tricky thing to actually take measurements, etc. on farms. While you're there, Paul, there was one comment I saw, one question I saw, or comment actually I saw that came up from Jan Ledoux, a colleague of mine, which was basically saying that understanding of mixed swards is not actually so, understanding of the management of mixed swards is not so bad perhaps as you actually put forward.
I wouldn't say it's bad or particularly challenging. It's just there's a variety of a lot of the tools we use to monitor forage even things like a rising plate meter don't work as well on a diverse sward, or at least they have to be calibrated for it. Things like forage quality testing, particularly if you're using near infrared testing, it works okay with mixed swards provided it's calibrated for it. So you do have to be quite careful when you submit a forage sample from a diverse sward to a lab for analysis. If that lab is assuming most of the swards that they work with are perennial ryegrass, you may get quality results that are perhaps much lower than what it actually is. So I think those are the type of challenges I was talking about when I spoke about the challenges of mixed swards. Certainly weed control is one. One issue with diversity is part of the diversity you're going to get with mixed swards will be some undesirable plants. In the past, we've relied very much on herbicides to knock out broadleaf plants. And as soon as that tool, or if you're aiming for more diverse swards, you're going to lose that tool for weed control. So I think that's another management challenge that some people may find a bit daunting if they're not used to approaching it that way.
Okay, thanks for that. Now there's a comment here from Christina to M saying a simple starting point is to empower grassland farmers with the knowledge of their value of soils. That's a question I put to Drew. Drew, would you like to come in here and sort of comment as a farmer? How do you look at this field and say this is going in the right direction?
Yeah, well, I suppose I see a question through there on soil sampling and all, and it's good farmer practice to sample our soils every 3 to 4 years, which is common on our own farm. How do we know the likes of carbon? Just we've so little knowledge on it and having an understanding to really pass comment on that. But again, we're always looking for a good, healthy soil, one that can generate a good crop, obviously, and soil sampling does play an important role in that, and we do it, as I said, every 3 to 4 years.
Great, thanks for that. Now, there were some other questions I saw earlier about, or comments, on potential mixed arable and livestock and that came up as well before. Anyone want to sort of pick up on that one? I don't know whether that's something, Becky, that the UKCCC, no, Jürgen, do you want to comment on that?
We have a lot of those systems in Denmark, actually. But they're challenging in other environmental aspects, because as you're moving into rotational grasslands, you do have quite a lot of risk of losing carbon again, but you also have a tremendous loss of risk of losing nitrogen, nitrate leaching, nitrous oxide emissions, and so on. So it's that linkage, not just with the carbon, but with the nitrogen, that actually provides a risk of trade-offs or leakages with other types of emissions. So whereas, of course, that provides the opportunity to have other outputs, higher cereal yields, other types of forage crops, and so on, it also provides other risks in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and other types of losses.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel want to comment on that? No, if not, then I sort of move on. There was some other comments in there about different types of crops. And I think that's in terms of arable, and the fact that with, I guess we're discussing grassland, but since it came up in the questions or the comments here, Jürgen, any comments on the arable systems with the fallow for a long period of time? Any role that grassland can play in that? Any potential for grassland in terms of the bioeconomy, for example? Not necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, so something we're developing in Denmark, actually, and it's extremely hot here because we have this large pork industry in Denmark, and also consumers are becoming worried about our soy import from South America. So we're developing grasslands for producing green protein, to have this biorefining, where we squeeze the protein out of the grass to feed to the pigs and poultry, so that and then we actually take the rest to feed to the cattle. So in fact, and it turns out to be very good cattle feed, actually, and they don't really have any need for additional protein. There's sufficient protein in what they get there, and we have that additional protein in the refined protein out of the grass for feeding the pigs. So we can improve our overall system, and this is another type of mixed system, so to speak, where we both have cattle and pigs, and we can do without the soy.
Okay, anyone want to comment? Becky, so UKCCC, you put up a graph, and you put out some things that were sort of showing beef and dairy as separate, but you know, the beef and the dairy industry, some of the dairy calves go into the beef industry, and does UKCCC works at a very high level, obviously, and you're not sort of getting down to the specific systems, but does that get discussed at all, or is that left to your sort of expert groups, and then the sort of difference between different types of farming systems is sort of lost at that level? And
we did have a discussion on that, and there is a bit of a mention of it actually in the land use report, so I've just got it out to remind myself. And we're actually revisiting some of that data now. So we do have to work at a really high level, which is, and I'm learning so much from you all today, you know. I think we are looking again at some of these agricultural numbers, because I think what we learned from that land use report was what's really material and important. So we need to then make sure those numbers are correct and follow the latest thinking. And the latest thinking is moving so fast in this area. We're revisiting pigs and poultry at the moment as well. And I will make sure we are revisiting, we did actually cover off the dairy and beef herd. We have mentioned it. I think in terms of sort of materiality, the pig and poultry is a significant issue because of the production of the food. And so we're actually saying we shouldn't have just targeted just cattle and lamb, but we should be looking more holistically across. So we're revisiting some of those numbers now. We are being pushed to assume more dietary change could happen as a pathway, and I'm uncomfortable with that. But I think what we'll do is and I think we're talking about this externally, saying instead of just having one pathway, we're going to look at alternative pathways. So we're going to have a people-led pathway that covers all the sectors, and that would include a larger amount of dietary care change. We can have an innovation-led pathway, which would include sort of a higher amount of maybe meat substitutes. And we're going to have something which we've called headwinds, which is just looking at what we're doing now, but a little bit more so. So assuming that 20% of dietary change could occur. I would also say on the cattle, we've actually only seen a 10% reduction in grazing land by 2050 compared to 2017. So it's only actually 10%. And I think you have to put that in the context of a 20% reduction that's occurred in the last 2 decades. So we have really tried to be quite cautious about some of it. I'm not really answering your question here, but sorry.
It's provoked some thinking, and I think you know, one thing we'd also like to hear from you is because there was some comments early on about how do people engage with UKCCC, and
yeah,
you know, to some extent, one of the things about science is that individual scientists have their own views on things, and science is much better if you can have a forum for discussion. So is this sort of thing useful? And how could we, what sort of topics, or how could we as a collective, if you like, engage more as to feeding in to these? You mentioned that there's quite a lot of consultation, but is there more that we could be doing?
Yeah, I think it's sort of keeping an eye on it. So we have these calls for evidence, which is great if you can all feed into, but do you always know when they're happening? We also have quite a lot of roundtables, and they're often invitation only. But what we do is we try and cover all the stakeholders in that. So, for example, we held a range of roundtables for the land use report, where we had the NFU were there, we had people from supermarkets, we had dietitians, we had a range of different people, various professors of agriculture came to those. We also had for the land use, because I was worried about such a technical subject and us not being experts on it within the committee, because we can't be experts on the whole of the UK economy. So we set up an expert advisory group, which was a standing group which met about 5 times and wrote some reports for us on that as well. So going forward, we do have one-to-one meetings, but it's easier for us if we can talk to one person who represents a larger constituency. So, you know, talking to a farmers union representative is very good. Talking to the representative of a farmers group works very well. So maybe talking to a few representatives on behalf of the whole of the British Grassland Association might be a way forward. We read scientific papers, so we base a lot of our work on scientific papers. So for you academics out there, you know, we need to read stuff that's been peer reviewed, and that's how we can then say, okay, we have looked at this and we've taken that into account. I hope that helps a bit.
Yeah, no, that's. I think we've all in this in these periods of huge challenges that we face. If we're going to actually deal with some of these challenges by 2030. Then the more we understand each other and listen to each other and try and help each other do our jobs better, then the faster progress, more likely we are to make progress here. So I think we should be coming to the end of this. I'm just sort of looking through to see whether there's any final questions that we should be raising here. But I think the speakers have done an excellent job in answering a lot of these questions as we've gone through, and we will be circulating the chat to all participants, and also a recording of this and the PowerPoints from these talks. So yeah, people will be able to capture what these questions and what the discussion and the responses to some of these have actually been. So unless there's any final points that coming up, that's, oh, I think then I should just end by saying a very big thank you to all the speakers. I think we're all getting better at doing Zoom meetings and putting screen sharing and changing our videos and our mutes and everything else. So thank you for the speakers for putting together these and for giving up their time in the early evening or mid-evening in Jürgen's time. And thank you to all of you who've attended. I see we've even had some international participants, with someone from Iran signing up there. So very good to have you all. I think there's been a lot of positive feedback from these two webinars, and if people have any suggestions for the webinars, I see there's been someone from Brazil, excellent. Then if anyone has suggestions, there's been some discussion about global warming potential, and that may be another one that gets reorganized in the future as a collective of these different societies. But please send any suggestions to the organisers of this, where you got the invitations from to start with. So thanks very much to everyone, and stay safe. And I'm not going to go through the jargon from the different governments as to what the current strap lines for COVID are, but thanks very much everyone, and keep in touch. And thanks, sorry, I should also say thanks very much indeed to the BSAS team and to CGM, who helped to organise this and make sure that people got all the links, etc. So thanks to BSAS, BGS, to the Stapleton, and to the organisers, CGM. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.